I thought I was going to die right there in the car, but he had other plans.
Ronda Stapley survived Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was a popular American serial killer who confessed to killing over 30 individuals. In October 1974, Ronda Stapley, a 21-year-old pharmacy student at the University of Utah, was waiting for a bus when a charming stranger in a tan Volkswagen Beetle stopped by and offered her a ride. She accepted the ride because the driver blended in like a normal student, so she didn't have any doubt. Unfortunately, the driver was Ted Bundy. Bundy drove her to a secluded canyon, where he brutally assaulted and attempted to kill her. Miraculously, Ronda managed to escape by jumping into a fast-moving river, which carried her to safety. Then she walked all night to her hostel. She kept this traumatic experience a secret for decades before sharing her story publicly. Monica Hunter survived the Grim Sleeper.
He said, "You want a ride?" I said, "Yes, I will take a ride, sir."
Lonnie David Franklin Jr., also known as the Grim Sleeper, was an American serial killer who murdered at least 10 women. He targeted mostly black women within Los Angeles. Monica Hunter was walking home when Franklin stopped to offer her a ride. She accepted the ride. Franklin started driving and gradually increased his speed. When Monica sensed danger, she tried getting off of the car, but Franklin threatened her with a screwdriver. He drove her to a secluded area and demanded she undress. Before he could attack, a passerby appeared, allowing Hunter to escape. She reported the incident to the housing authority but feared involving the police due to past negative experiences. Hunter shared her story decades later, shedding light on her narrow escape from a serial killer. Carl Stoddard survived Dennis Nilsen.
Because you don't expect to go back to a bloke's house that smelled dead bodies.
Dennis Nilsen was a Scottish serial killer who abducted and murdered at least 12 young men and boys between 1978 and 1983. In May 1982, 21-year-old Carl Stoddard, a drag artist, met Dennis Nilsen at a London pub. Nilsen invited Carl to his home, where Carl fell asleep. When he woke up, he found Nilsen attempting to drown him in a bathtub. Believing Carl was dead, he left him for a while. He later noticed signs of life and decided to revive him. He cared for Carl over days before releasing him. Carl's testimony later played a crucial role in Nilsen's conviction. Cynthia Vigil survived David Parker Ray.
Did a lot of sick stuff.
David Parker Ray, also known as the Toy Box Killer, was an American serial killer who tortured and murdered an unknown number of women over many decades, and is believed to have killed over 60 people. Ray and his accomplice, Cindy Hendy, abducted 22-year-old Cynthia Vigil in 1999. They transported her to Ray's soundproof trailer in Elephant Butte, where she was subjected to 3 days of torture. While Ray was at work, Vigil seized an opportunity when Hendy left the keys unattended. She unlocked her chains, but Hendy confronted her. Leading to a struggle, Vigil managed to stab Hendy with an ice pick and escaped. She sought help from a nearby homeowner, who provided assistance and contacted the police. Vigil's courageous escape led to Ray's arrest and the discovery of his crimes. Carol DaRonch survived Ted Bundy.
He introduced himself as Officer Roseland.
In November 1974, Bundy dressed up as a police officer and approached 18-year-old Carol DaRonch at a shopping mall in Utah. He posed as though he was filing a report on car break-in. He convinced Carol to accompany him to his vehicle. She sensed danger when Bundy drove a different route. She attempted to escape, but Bundy tried to handcuff her, but she fought back fiercely. She managed to escape from the car and flag down a passing vehicle for help. She later testified against Ted Bundy that led to his conviction. Lisa McVey survived Bobby Joe Long.
I could have been dead. I could have been lying down in some ditch or somewhere.
Bobby Joe Long, a man who killed at least 10 women and sexually assaulted over 50 in Tampa, kidnapped 17-year-old Lisa McVey while she was riding her bike home on November 3, 1984. For 26 hours, Lisa was blindfolded, held at gunpoint, sexually assaulted and tortured. Despite her fear, she stayed calm and used her quick thinking to survive. She spoke kindly to Joe Long and told him she needed to care for her sick father, which touched his emotions. This made Joe Long to let her go. After her release, Lisa immediately contacted the police and gave them detailed information about her kidnapper. Her bravery helped the police find and arrest Long. She was present during Bobby Joe Long's execution. Cindy Paulson survived Robert Hansen. Robert Hansen, a successful businessman who turned into a serial killer, operated within Alaska between 1972 and 1983, hunting, assaulting, and killing over 17 women. He would often release his victims into the desert, then use his firearms to chase and hunt them. In June 1983, he kidnapped 17-year-old Cindy Paulson. He then attempted to fly her to a remote cabin, but while he was loading his plane, Cindy seized the opportunity and escaped. Still handcuffed, she managed to flag down a passing truck for help. Her story helped the police to arrest Hansen. Felicity Nightingale survived Fred West. In April 1980, Felicity Nightingale, then 22, was hitchhiking when Fred West, a future notorious serial killer who would kill over 12 women, including his daughter, offered her a lift. Initially hesitant, she accepted. After he insisted, she placed her rucksack in the back of his van. During a break, West's demeanor turned controlling and angry, criticizing her family's acceptance of her hitchhiking. He invited her to stay with his family, but she declined. Back on the road, West attempted to mislead her about the route. He was becoming increasingly agitated. Sensing danger, Nightingale exited the van at the next opportunity and secured another ride. Years later, she recognized West in a news reports detailing his involvement in the torture and murder of multiple women. Donette Wilt survived Christopher Wilder. Christopher Wilder, known as the Beauty Queen Killer, killed 8 out of the 10 known women he abducted and sexually assaulted during his cross-country killing spree in early 1984. That same year, he kidnapped 16-year-old Donette Wilt in Gary, Indiana. He was assisted by Tina Marie Risico, another captive he forced to help lure victims. He forced Donette into his car at gunpoint, covering her eyes and mouth with duct tape. Over several days, he assaulted her while traveling. He attempted to suffocate Donette. When she resisted, he stabbed her multiple times and left her to die. Donette managed to reach a road and found help, leading to a hospital recovery and providing authorities with crucial information on Wilder's whereabouts. Jeffrey Rignall survived John Wayne Gacy.
Together, but in order to demonstrate it here,
26-year-old Rignall encountered John Wayne Gacy, a serial killer who killed over 33 young men. Gacy lured Jeffrey into his car by offering him a ride and to smoke a joint with him. He then held a rag soaked in chloroform over Rignall's mouth until he became unconscious. He then took him to his home where he was tortured and sexually assaulted. After everything, Gacy eventually released Jeffrey unconscious in Lincoln Park. Upon regaining consciousness, he sought medical attention and reported the crime, but the police did not take him seriously. He conducted his own investigation, identifying Gacy's vehicle and residence. His information later contributed to Gacy's arrest and conviction. Larry Flint survived Joseph Paul Franklin.
I wished I could go back and change things, but there's no way I can do it, so...
Joseph Paul Franklin was an American serial killer, white supremacist, and domestic terrorist who killed almost 22 people between 1970 and 1980. On March 6, 1978, Larry Flint, a publisher of Hustler magazine, was attending a court proceeding when he was fatally shot by Joseph Paul. Joseph Paul was consumed with anger by the interracial contents Flynn shared in his magazine. The attack left Flint paralyzed from the waist down, confining him to a wheelchair for the remainder of his life. Despite the severity of his injuries, Flint opposed the death penalty and advocated against Franklin's execution, which ultimately took place in 2013. Rose Stewart survived Dean Carter. Dean Philip Carter tortured, sexually assaulted, and murdered up to 5 women in California in April 1984. He would often befriend his victims before attacking them. Days before she was attacked, Carter tried to befriend 22-year-old Jennifer Rose Stewart, but she refused. On that faithful day, Carter broke into her home with a knife and sexually assaulted her for more than 5 hours. Trying to save her life, Rose pretended to enjoy the activity and asked him to untie her so she can kiss him. After the kiss, Carter walked away on his own accord. Rose waited for about 5 minutes before fleeing to a neighbor for help. Whitney Bennett survived Richard Ramirez.
I think most humans have in them the capacity to commit murder.
Between April 1984 to August 1985, serial killer Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker, murdered at least 14 people during various home invasions. In July 1985, 16-year-old Whitney Bennett fell asleep in her bedroom in Sierra Madre, California, leaving her window open. Later that night, Ramirez entered through the unlocked window with an iron rod in his hands. He repeatedly beat Whitney up with the iron. After a while, he went to the kitchen to get a knife. When he couldn't get one, he attempted to strangle her with a telephone cord, but fled when he saw sparks from the cord and believed divine intervention had occurred. Bennett survived, but went through over 478 stitches to save her butchered scalp. She later testified against Ramirez in court, helping convict him for other murders. Rebecca Garde survived. Gary Ridgeway.
I'm the only survivor.
Gary, Leon Ridgeway, also known as the Green River Killer, killed over 49 individuals between 1980 to 1990. He attacked mostly female sex workers and vulnerable people. In November 1982, Rebecca Garde was picked up as a prostitute by Ridgeway. He showed her his ID. She then accepted the ride. Ridgeway drove her to a secluded area where he attempted to strangle her. Garde managed to escape and ran to a nearby trailer for help. She didn't immediately report to the police because she thought they would not believe her. She later gave account of her experience years later. Holly Dunn survived Angel Maturino Resendez.
I'm Holly Dunn, and I survived a serial killer.
Angel Maturino Resendez, known as the Railroad Killer, was a Mexican serial killer who killed over 23 people across the United States and Mexico during the 1990s. In August 1997, Holly Dunn and her boyfriend, Chris Mayer, were walking near railroad tracks in Lexington, Kentucky, when they were attacked by Angel. He immediately killed Holly's boyfriend and tied up Holly, whom he sexually harassed, severely tortured, stabbed multiple times, and left her to die from her wounds. Luckily, Holly survived the brutal attack and later provided crucial testimony that contributed to Resendez's capture and conviction. She was the only survivor of the Railroad Killer. Tracy Edwards survived Jeffrey Dahmer.
He was listening to my heart because at a point he told me he was going to eat my heart at that point.
Was an American serial killer who killed and dismembered over 17 young men and boys between 1978 and 1991. On July 22, 1991, Dahmer approached 3 young men and asked them to follow him to his apartment for a nude photograph. He offered to pay each $100. Only one of them, Tracy Edwards, agreed to follow him. Upon entering Dahmer's room, he perceived a foul odor. While still inside, Dahmer handcuffed Edwards and turned on the videotape of The Exorcist 3 and started rhyming to the chant. He brought out a knife and told Edwards that he wanted to eat his heart. Edwards got scared and made up his mind to escape at any given opportunity. When he got an opportunity, he forcefully punched Dahmer in the face and ran off to the road still handcuffed. There, he flagged 2 police officers who followed him back to Dahmer's apartment and discovered his many years of atrocities and was arrested. He later testified against Dahmer in court. Corazon Amuro survived Richard Speck. On July 13, 1966, Corazon Amuro, a Filipina exchange nurse, was living with 8 fellow student nurses in a Chicago townhouse. That night, Richard Speck broke into their residence, systematically tortured, sexually assaulted, and murdered 8 of the nurses. Amuro managed to escape by hiding under the bed throughout the period Speck carried out his activities. Hours later, after the incident, she quietly came out and reported the whole incident to the authorities, who arrested Richard Speck and sentenced him to life imprisonment until he died of heart failure. Teresa Thornhill survived Robert Black. Robert Black was a Scottish serial killer who targeted only extremely young females between the ages of 5 and 11 years. 15-year-old Teresa Thornhill was returning from the park when she noticed a blue van following her. She kept walking until the driver of the van, Robert Black, drew closer to her and asked if she could fix car engines. Teresa never responded and walked even faster until Robert caught up with her and gave her a bear hug from the back and covered her face with his large hands. She couldn't breathe properly. Then she grabbed his testicles and bit his hands. She was still struggling and kicking her legs as Robert was trying to force her into the van until a friend then shouted at him, and he forcefully dropped Teresa and drove off. A few years later, Robert Black was caught and sentenced to life in prison. Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler survived Ted Bundy.
Thank God it's over.
For Kathy, on January 15, 1978, after Ted Bundy escaped from prison, he broke into Florida State University's Omega sorority house in Tallahassee, where 4 young women were fast asleep. In the early hours of the day, holding a heavy piece of wood, he entered the first 2 rooms where the first 2 victims, 21-year-old Margaret Bowman and 20-year-old Lisa Levy, were sleeping, and brutally murdered them with his wood after sexually assaulting them with broken bottles. Then he entered the shared room of Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler. Bundy attacked both, inflicting severe injuries. Their lives were spared when car headlights illuminated their room, startling Bundy and causing him to flee. Both women survived and later testified against Bundy, contributing to his conviction. Tali Shapiro survived Rodney Alcala.
And everyone looking at me like I was supposed to be dead.
Tali Shapiro was only 8 years old when she was kidnapped by Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer. On September 25, 1968, Tali Shapiro was walking to school. When Rodney offered her a ride to school, she hesitated, but Rodney convinced her by saying he knew her parents. He managed to lure Tali to his house instead. He hit her in the head, and she became unconscious. He then sexually assaulted and beat her up. A bystander who noticed how Rodney was behaving around the young girl when they came in immediately called the police. When the police arrived, they found the unconscious body of Tali Shapiro half-clothed and lying on the floor. While the police were still attending to her, Rodney escaped through the back door and was never caught until 2 years later. Brian Hartnell survived the Zodiac Killer.
I just don't want this to happen again to anyone else.
The Zodiac Killer is one of the most famous unsolved and unidentified serial killer who murdered over 5 people around San Francisco Bay Area between December 1968 and October 1969. On September 27, 1969, Brian Hartnell and his girlfriend Cecilia Shepard were picnicking at Lake in California when a man approached them wearing a hooded costume like that of the executioner. He claimed to be an escaped convict needing money and a car to flee to Mexico. He then proceeded to bind their wrists with a clothesline and stabbed them both multiple times. Despite his severe injuries, Hartnell survived by playing dead until he left. He managed to call for help, and both of them were transported to a hospital. Tragically, his girlfriend died 2 days later. Hartnell's detailed account of the attack provided crucial information to investigators about the Zodiac Killer's methods and appearance, but he was never caught. Maria Viracheva survived Alexander Pichushkin. In 2002, 19-year-old Maria Viracheva, who was 3 months pregnant at the time, had an argument with her boyfriend and found herself distraught in a Moscow metro station. There, she encountered Alexander Pichushkin, later known as the chessboard killer, who murdered over 48 people. Pichushkin lured her into Bitsa Park under the guise of showing her hidden cameras. Once isolated, he attacked Maria and pushed her into a sewage well. Miraculously, she managed to climb out and escaped, becoming one of the few survivors of Pichushkin's brutal attacks. Although she reported the incident to police, they didn't investigate. She was only called in later in 2007 to identify him after he had committed many more murders. Christopher Bryson survived Robert Berdella. During the 1980s, Robert Andrew, also known as the Kansas City Butcher, kidnapped, sexually assaulted, tortured and murdered at least 6 young men. All his victims endured up to 6 weeks of torture. In April 1988, he kidnapped Christopher Bryson, a 22-year-old male prostitute. He tied him to his bed and sexually assaulted him for days. Bryson stayed calm and managed to earn his trust by pretending to cooperate. While Berdella left for work, Bryson managed to free his hands and jumped from a second-story window, wearing only a dog collar. He ran to a neighbor for help, leading police to arrest Berdella and uncover his horrific crimes. Thank you guys for watching.